Everybody, welcome that's joining the webinar. We have Mr. Charles P. Rettig. He's for those that don't know, he is the 49th Commissioner of the IRS, and I've been told to only call him Chuck. So please know that I'm being respectful when I say that. But he goes by Chuck. So as Commissioner, Chuck presided over the nation's tax system. What people probably don't know is the IRS collects approximately $3 trillion in tax revenue each year. So he managed an agency of about 80,000 employees and a budget of approximately $11 billion. So the main focus in leading the IRS is improving the service to the nation's taxpayers, balancing the appropriate enforcement of the nation's laws, while also respecting taxpayer rights. So it's obviously a huge job. Prior to that, Chuck spent many years in private practice. He represented thousands of individuals, businesses, corporate taxpayers before the IRS, and the DOJ, federal, state courts, and state taxing authorities. And he's obviously held numerous leadership roles in various professional organizations across the country, as well as received many professional honors, as you would imagine. He's been a featured speaker and panelist at hundreds of tax conferences throughout the United States and internationally, and has authored many tax-related articles. So he's done it all. We're very excited to have you with us, Chuck, and want to welcome you. First, is there anything that I missed there that's notable?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Chuck, but I believe the first and only tax attorney to be the commissioner of the IRS as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the last was in 1959 or so was Dana Latham. If you know, there's a national firm, Latham and Watkins. And so Dana Latham was commissioner in like 1959, thereabouts.
Very cool.
I don't know. Maybe it was stuff people thought that was good, or people thought otherwise. You know, personally, as a tax guy, I if you want to start there, I can start with sort of my thought on, if you're leading a tax agency, you should know something about tax, and you should know something about what the agency does. And for many years, people thought of the IRS as sort of a data processing agency or a financial services agency. And, it is that. But when you really, we have a voluntary compliance tax system, et cetera, it seems to me that it's important that the people at the upper end know something about tax, right? And know the importance of how it interacts with everything else that transpires. Yeah, you got a lot of career people who know a lot about tax, but having people come in from the outside, to me, is critical for the agency to really earn the respect of people and maybe help, shift the focus of the agency. I do come from a small business background. My dad had a truck and 2 large boys, and that was with family business, and whatnot. And, in terms of tax professionals, I was a tax guy on the outside for 36 years. My wife is a tax accountant. She works in the tax department of a business return management firm. I've learned, I used to say tax season was, February to April and then August to October. I have learned that it's January 1 to December 31, and, the importance of all that. And it's more than just putting information into a computer and having it come out and look like a tax return. Obviously, I'm saying that in jest, but, keep in mind, what I saw on the outside, I did both civil and criminal tax litigation. The return that gets put together and gets put into the system, if it gets called up for, certainly a field examination or a criminal investigation, everybody is looking at everything in that return and the backup for the return. And so, I've always been a proponent of get the information to the people preparing the returns early so that it can be put together in a timely manner rather than putting it in the system. And then, so frequently we're all busy, we don't reflect on going back to see something that was filed, maybe until we get an audit notice. It's okay. There's a process of amending a return. And if you look at a return, get it in. I'm a proponent of getting returns timely filed. But take a look, and if it needs to be amended, go ahead and amend it. That's really what the system is about. You want the narrative, if you've got an audit, you want the narrative to be about what's in the returns, not what's not in the returns, right? Not in the returns, now you're on your heels. In the returns, it's, well, we did this and we explained it and whatnot. So that might be more than what we were looking to lead off with, but that's sort of a combination, right? From, having served on both sides of that particular fence. And, at the end of the day, our clients sign their returns. And, I used to say on the outside, tax return is not an offer to negotiate. It's a very important document. It's signed under penalties of perjury, and we all do our best. But no, and I think part of what, John and Greg and I are going to try to bring forth, the IRS is an agency of people, and they get it. They know that mistakes happen. So they're not looking for the aha moment. They're more looking in an examination context. They're more looking for what happened and why. What's the explanation here? And then how do we resolve it? And let's just move on, right? They're not looking to make an example out of a person. And, IRS employees crosswise are real people. And they have, family members. They live in our communities. They interact with us. So, reasonable explanations come forth.
So I think that's great introduction there, Chuck. One thing I wanted to kind of just start off with here before we go into opportunities, which I know everyone's interested in. You have 80,000 people under your head. It's a pretty overwhelming thing. You came from private practice, obviously you had a large firm, but 80,000 is a lot of people. From a day-to-day perspective, what does the commissioner actually do? How in the weeds are you with the things that we all see in the media, things us as tax practitioners know about, or the things that clients just see on the headlines? How involved in the weeds does the commissioner get, and how involved did you get, and what did the day-to-day look like?
So by and large, commissioner does not get involved in specific taxpayer matters. That's left to the career people. And there's more or less a wall between, you have commissioner, and then under the commissioner, you have a deputy commissioner for ops support, which is the CFO, CIO, and all that. And then you have a deputy commissioner for service and enforcement. Service and enforcement's the part of the IRS that most people are familiar with. There's a reasonable wall between the service and enforcement and the commissioner. And so if a call came in and it was somebody who wanted to talk about a taxpayer matter, that call gets diverted off to deputy commissioner, service and enforcement, and I likely would never know about it. That call could come in from practitioners or others. That call could also come in off the Hill, right? A senator or a congressperson has somebody and they want to make sure the commissioner is aware of this matter. And they're not going to deal with the number 2 guy. They want to deal with the number 1 guy. I'm United States Senator and et cetera, and all that. And so then, the call comes in, then I'll take the call with the deputy commissioner, but I control the call and say, Senator, it's a pleasure to meet you, et cetera. However, I have with me my deputy commissioner, which was Doug O'Donnell in the end. And he's going to interact with your people on this. So you and I don't need to interact with this, Senator. Doug will interact with your staff and they'll handle it. And if there's something that Doug feels the need for me to be involved in, I'll be involved in. But that never happened. The deputy commissioners know, cut it off, right? Don't put the commissioner in that position. Beyond that, on a day-to-day basis, I think every commissioner runs the shop a little bit differently. I'm very much, in my mind at least, a people person. Care a lot about, the people, which is the employees as well as tax professionals as well as taxpayers. I think that if you go back and look at, what transpired while we were there, you'll see that. I was the guy I was commissioner when we went into COVID, and we had the CARES Act, which was the first of 3 rounds of stimulus payments. So I could have sat, if you will, in an ivory tower back in Washington and said, well, poor country, poor people, poor this, poor that. We didn't. We leaned into it, and it was, well, what can we do? And so we came out, the CARES Act was March of 2020. We came out with the People First initiative within a week of the CARES Act. And basically, I reached to the tax professional community and said, if you're me, what do you need done that I can do without changing the Internal Revenue Manual, without engaging Treasury, right? What can I do, and what do you need done now, right? From a Monday, and that came in from private practitioners, said, we really need this. We suspended examinations, but we also suspended payments and gave interest relief to people, et cetera. Just put everybody on a holiday, if you will, right? And when we open back up, they're no worse the wear. So we don't want interest accruing. We don't want them making payments. We wanted people, whether they're practitioners or whether they're taxpayers, to focus on themselves, right? We'll deal with what we need to deal with, but the IRS, and if somebody owes or has a filing issue, the IRS should not be their problem. let them deal with the people side of their world, family, community, and all that. That also gave us a breather I shut down the IRS, right? There are 519 offices. I sent 83,000 employees home. I brought our employees in foreign countries back to the U.S., theory being if they needed hospitalization or something, have them be hospitalized in the United States. But we also need to figure out how to get back on the horse and do our job, right? So, yeah, it sounds great to say I was concerned about health and safety of the employees. At the same time, we're figuring out we've got to switch to a virtual environment immediately. And this was not an agency that was otherwise a virtual environment, as you all know, right?
Yeah.
Very much paper-based and people-based. So I was very engaged in this needs to happen, and it needs to happen yesterday, right? And so a lot of things that we were doing, Commissioner has a tremendous amount of power and sway. And, before I got on board, somebody said, well, you're going to learn if you look to the left, 300 IRS employees go to the left. When you look to the right, they go off to the right. And what I wanted to hear from them, right? Don't tell me what you think I want to know. Tell me what we need to know, what we need to do to make it different. And I approached the tax professional community the same way. I've always seen myself as a tax guy, right? I'm a lawyer. I practiced as a tax lawyer, but rarely did anybody ever hear me say, "Oh, I'm a tax lawyer." I used to say the only person who really cared that I was a tax lawyer was my mom. I'm the only one in my family to go to college. Then I went to law school. Then I went to graduate law school, and so my mom liked the idea that I was a tax lawyer, right? And I'm probably the least successful person in my family, but hey, I got all this college education, and I used to tell people, telling you that I got this college education tells you that I'm number 3 of 3. In the generation, my generation, and certainly my parents' generation, college wasn't the same, right? It was, and I'm a Vietnam era high school kid. I got out of high school in 1974, so our entire neighborhood went to Vietnam. Every male 2 years older went to Vietnam. So you want to take calculus, and then you go into Vietnam to carry a rifle? Oh, I want to go to the beach, right? I mean, you need a certain grade point average to get in. I grew up in California to the University of California system. No, because I'm going 12 weeks or 10 weeks or something of basic training, and they're going to drop me out of a helicopter and wish me well. So it was a different mindset and all of that. So that's kind of where I come from. And I think it was, I'll say, people used to say inside the IRS when they're coming in to meet, I told you he's different, right? I used to say in a good way. And, part of it, and Greg and John, I've got a son who is a major medical officer in the Army who's deployed twice. That's a different look at the world compared to, I grew up in Los Angeles. My wife, as many people know, came into this country as a refugee. She's born and raised in Vietnam. She escaped from Vietnam in 1982, 17 years old. She was a boat person, so 101 people, 27-foot boat, rescued at sea, refugee camp in Singapore. She came into the United States at 17, not knowing English, right? And so it's part of a refugee community. And then ultimately, her parents made it out of Vietnam. They live in Little Saigon and they don't speak English. I just told you my entire IRS career, but through my family, right? I first commissioner to go to the Pentagon. I went twice, dealing with military VITA, making sure that the military is aware of the importance of filing system. We rapidly expanded into other languages. I used to ask, why is the 1040 only in English? I'm in LA, 3 blocks from my house. Every sign on the street's in Spanish, right? And then a mile from there, it's all in Japanese and it's all in Korean. So if you're a public agency, you need to earn the trust and respect of people. You go into their community, in their language, and help them. Tax professionals, first round economic impact payments. I got a call from a tax professional in New Jersey, and he said, your friends want to help you. What can we do? We had to issue economic impact payments as rapidly as possible. We put the outreach materials in English. And I said, I need it in other languages. So we need to go into communities from a Monday to a Friday. On Friday, I got our outreach materials in 35 different languages. That was entirely done by tax professionals on the outside. Try to go into a very ethnic community that may not have a lot of people filing returns and saying, we're from the IRS, we're here to help you, but you need to file a return and we'll get you $1,200. And it's all in English. They've heard that before, right? So what happened is caring about people, and then COVID took us into the communities in a very important way, right? We took people from the communities back into the communities to show how we're here to help the communities, rather than taking people who are foreign to the community into the community to say, hey, I'm from the IRS and I'm here to help you, right? You know?
Yeah. Well, that
a lot
from the government, I'm here to help.
Yeah, a lot of the immigrant communities, they reside in the United States because some other government told them that, just as they, imprisoned or executed a family member, right? So my background, I think, and family background, very much reflects what we were able to do. And some people say, unfortunately, you were there during COVID. And I look at it and go, no, fortunately, I was here, because I like to think that I care, and I want to make sure everybody else cared. And we had to really operate differently. We could not operate like a government agency. We had to operate like people who care about other people and happen to be housed in a government agency. So I'll just give you one quick because we issued 3 rounds of economic impact payments in March 2020, December 2020, and March 2021. We did it in record time. The first round went out within 2 weeks of March 27, which is the CARES Act. We launched over 100 million payments on April 10. The second round went out within 48 hours on December 27 from when the statute was enacted. The third round went out within 24 hours. Arguably, the Anti-Deficiency Act says we couldn't even have looked at it until there's a statute and we received funding for it. My joke is we would still be doing the first round. I didn't care about the statute. Somebody could fire me and send me back from Washington, D.C. to my home in L.A., have at it, but we're going to blow through this, and we're going to do what we think is the right thing, right? That was significant in terms of taking IRS, and people can think what they want to think about the IRS, but taking the IRS from this sort of behind the screen agency that's just after you or the tax professional to, hey, you know what? We're the people that shut down our day operations. Yeah, I sent people home. But by end of May, beginning of June, I was bringing tens of thousands of people back in to do this work, right? Because we are a government public service group. We needed to do it. And the employees understood the importance of it. Just like I said about languages, I could do that in 10 different slots for you. But I'm a little bold, right? So my second week, I said, how many languages do we operate? Again, I live in LA and I grew up in LA. My dad is born in Germany. My wife, in Vietnam, right? Neither of them came to this country speaking language. How many languages do we operate in? My second week there, and somebody says 4. And I look over and went, we're in the United States of America, right? There's 170 languages fluently spoken here. And I one of the 4. And somebody goes, well, Spanish. I'm not giving you that. I'm from LA. That's not a foreign language in LA. Come on, man. So the ability to reflect, and then also, we operate with smartphones and, laptops and the rest. There's more than 10 million people that don't have a smartphone. They don't operate, they're rural communities, or they just don't have. IRS needs to show them as much respect as we do the most sophisticated, smart people on the planet. Right?
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. I mean, one thing that I heard that was really remarkable to think about is just on the COVID topic, the COVID recovery was really administered through the IRS, right? So all the financial incentives that the government wanted to give out, tax system was the easiest way to do it. The IRS has all of our data. So as Chuck mentioned, if people remember back then, that stuff happened so quickly. I remember those payments came out, and the breadth of it, of 100 million transactions occurring in that short period of time is pretty crazy if you think about it. So I think that was a unique period for us. It was very stressful, obviously, but looking back on it, a lot of work got done, and the IRS did a good job there. One thing I want to shift into here, because I know people are interested. So you have this.
Greg, let me add it. There were 2 studies done by Inspector General on the first and third COVID distributions that we did. And on the first one, this is the Treasury Inspector General. So they're like our auditor, IRS auditor. I'm no longer at IRS. But the first one, they said we got it, the amounts of those payments accurate 98% of the time. The third one, we got it accurate 99% of the time. I will tell you, there were discussions in jest, but in my office of how are we going to do this as rapidly as possible? Let's contact the Air Force, fill a bunch of C-130s with cash, fly around the country and open the doors. We got the same chance as doing it in this environment, right? So I focus, and I want people to focus on those things, that there is talent in the agency. There is a care factor in the agency. And coming into sort of tax professionals and taxpayers, understand that when you're making your pitch to the IRS, whether it's a person at the IRS or globally, they get it. They live in the same communities as the rest of us. It's very important, I think, to try to get rid of that us versus them piece of the world. And, you know, you want to be there. So anyway, I cut you off and I apologize for that, Craig.
No, that's great input there. So, you know, one thing, you have this perspective of being a practicing tax attorney on the defense side, and I'm sure you had your fair share of strategies deployed as well over the years, and then kind of on the other side of it, seeing how these things are coming into the IRS. Now, I've heard other commissioners talk in the past, and from your perspective, you know, the average small business owner, the average real estate investor, the average growing, you know, entrepreneur in this community, what are things that you personally think people are neglecting from just a tax strategy perspective, a taxpayer perspective, that they can get better at, that tax professionals that can get better at, that the IRS is going to, you know, ultimately be on their side with? So I often see, you know, people don't deploy basic strategies, right? They just leave money on the table. I always joke the IRS isn't going to come knocking and say, you know, hey, John, you know, you left $5,000 on the table, you know, we'll give it to you, right? They're not going to tell you that. So what do you see as items that are often overlooked?
You know, the IRS is not the business of generating refunds, but you know, neither is Amazon, Target, or Walmart, or whatever, right? But if you're entitled to it, they will get it. So one is, you know, a tax return is not an offer to negotiate. A tax return is the opening bell, if you will, if it's going to be looked at. Let me back up a little bit. You want your tax return, the vast majority of tax returns are processed automatically, like 96, 98% of the returns. A human never sees them. You want that to happen. The audits happen, you know, the returns get selected for audit later in the process, usually 14 to 16 months after a return has been filed. So on the front end, I want my return to sail through, kind of like a fastball. I don't want a slow, easy pitch that the system says, okay, somebody needs to look at this now before we actually process it. And the returns that fall out, they call it, go up to Kansas City to Error Resolution Services. So what can cause a return to fall out? The biggest issue is a mismatch, right? There's a 1099, a K-1, or a W-2 that doesn't tie in to the information that the IRS already likely has in its system. So number one is some caution and care in getting that return as accurate as possible. Then when returns do fall out, and I think I may have said, you know, my wife, many years ago, but she was an auditor with California Franchise Tax Board, which is income tax agency in California. She has this thing about, and now she's been tax preparer for a long time in a business management firm. Put it in the right place on the return and call it the right thing, right? Because if the auditor or examiner is looking at it and it's on the wrong line, it brings a little more attention, right? And or it's called something different. Gee, you know, you've got, you know, this type of labor service as well. It's not really labor, you know, that's the insurance payment or whatever, right? Kind of thing. So some care on the front end. Now, I get it from a tax preparer point of view that there's often very little time and, you know, information comes in a variety of forms. You know, I used to joke and say, every client gives every, you know, tax professional all the information they ask for in a timely manner, exactly like they wanted, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I never met that client when I was on the outside in 36 years, but in their head, that's who they are, right? And it's professionally, it's difficult to say to the client, if an audit happens, you never gave us that information, right? And they're like, well, you signed the return. You're the preparer. You should have asked me if you needed more information. Clients never make mistakes if you ask them, right? But it's a team effort to get this thing right. Now, as a tax professional on the outside, I never wanted to throw the client under the bus. And I used to jump in front of a lot of trains, right? From a lot of different perspectives, because what we ultimately want, if there is an examination or an office audit or a correspondence audit, we want it to go away. We want to minimize the damage. And so know that returns that get selected for audit, and those, there's a lot of talk now about IRS and artificial intelligence and the rest. The IRS probably has as many data scientists and analysts as any other organization on the planet. It creates its work plans based on data that it has.
We lost. Oh, we're back. We lost your audio for a second, Chuck, but I think you're back.
Can you just restart at AI again? We lost you at AI.
I could if I was reading notes. So, IRS, by the way, I in 4 years, I did a lot of presentations. I think about 400 different presentations. We flipped the Zoom. I never used a script. It's just come in and saying what's there. Yeah. So AI is very important. The IRS is among the top, has more data scientists, data analysts, and whatnot than probably any other organization. Uses a lot of AI, because if you think about it, I have a son in the military, and one thing I learned is the military doesn't just send out the troops, at 360 degrees. The engineers in the military send up the drones and the satellites and figure out where they need to go. And you can kind of hit it with pinpoint precision where the problem is. The IRS is kind of a reflection of that. Don't say in the military, but don't think that they're just going to pick up returns to examine returns because it's Thursday. In 2021, 40% of the audit selection process was totally driven by AI. Then it went to 70%. And the only reason there's something there that's not AI now is it's carryover from earlier years, right? But it's driven by that. It's the largest data warehouse probably in the world, certainly in the United States. It gets about a trillion documents per year. Gets about 165 million 1040s per year. Add in all the other returns. So it's all there. So there's all this talk now about funding IRS, and IRS is going to use AI going forward. IRS has been using AI, what it had, and technology improves, right? But IRS has been using AI for the last 15 years. It has never really had the human resources to jump on the data that it's getting. So it had to be very selective on go audit here, go audit there. And also it had to be selective because it has a very broad bandwidth of responsibility. You got to audit the W-2, some W-2 1040 people. Most of those are going to be a non-issue, but you sort of have to be in the field. You also have to audit the super big corporations, and you're there all the time. But kind of everybody in between needs a touch, right? They got to have some presence in a lot of different taxpayer type communities. And with a lack of human resources, that presence is pretty small. So you obviously are going to use AI, data analytics. And probably 10 or 12 years ago, there was a significant shift to bring data scientists on board to the IRS. What does this data mean, right? Where can we be most effective to, again, send out our people to do it? So that's important because AI will pick out a type of return to look for, and then the system will go through and look for certain codes or certain issues or just information on certain lines, right? And so if you go, gee, the taxpayer got a correspondence audit questioning charitable deductions. Well, we know historically the DIF score said, if you add $100,000 of adjusted gross income, the average return with that shows $3,000 or $4,000 in charitable deductions. If some guy jumps in with $20,000 in charitable deductions, the system will kick it out, ask them about the charitable deductions. So that's kind of a more simplified scenario. But you can take the same concept and make it more complex in a lot of different arenas. And now you're going to get a set of eyes. That first one might just be an automated response. The computers might just generate a letter, please verify, right? Know that when they send out computer-generated letters to verify something, they get a lot of amended returns back, right?
Yeah.
So, and by the way, they don't jump on the amended return and think, oh, aha, we got one. Basically, they don't say thank you either. They just process it and move to the next one. So I know some people used to say, well, if I'm admitting that I got it wrong on the front end, I'd rather admit and deal with a computer than have to have my tax professional deal with a person, and maybe I answer the question of, well, why, what is this like this, right? And it's tough for tax professionals. You can't say my client didn't give me the information or they didn't give me the backup, right? That's going to lead to maybe a penalty consideration. So it's an artful discussion, right? If it gets there. And you
Chuck,
move into
I just wanted to drive into one like AI centered question. So the IRS is obviously investing heavily into like data scientists and just like human resources, which I think is super cool. People will want to hear more about that. Is a lot of like the increased use of AI, are those all like with solutions that are being kind of built within the organization, or does the IRS partner with private companies, and like is that something that happens?
So historically, because of funding problems, so you heard about in April 16, 2019, we launched the 6-year IRS modernization plan, right? $2.7 billion, and we're going to modernize all of our systems. By the 4th year, we had received 57% of the amount of funding we were supposed to receive for that. At the same time, we launched that, and people are going, 2.3 to 2.7 billion dollars. My God, what are they doing with all this money? JP Morgan and Bank of America were spending $10 billion a year upgrading their systems, which were better than our systems already, right? I used to say, why can't we just go get their systems? You know, the stuff they're throwing away, let's bring on board, and, you know, we're in it. So we launched that, and then we didn't get the funding for it. It was annualized funding. Well, when you don't get the funding, you either have to, and there's very limits. You can't just take from someplace else and put there. IRS gets funds in streams, right? And you can't put from one stream to another. So we had to pick and choose what we were going to do and what part of modernization we were not going to do. That was the IRS when I was there. I left November 12th, 2022. Commissioner's on a 5-year term. Every 5 years, as of November 12th, commissioner leaves. August 16, 2022, the IRS got $80 billion of funding. So under I like to say under my term, we got $80 billion. And then Danny, the new guy, first thing he did was lose $20 billion, right? Does the IRS need $80 billion? I was trying, every time I went to the Hill, I asked for timely, consistent, multi-year funding. So we can plan for this year and next year, right? The rest of us do that in the private sector. And IRS gets a chunk, and they get their funding usually in March. They're on a October 1 to September 30 fiscal year. Every time I was there, the annual funding came through in March, which meant we can't replenish, we can't rehire people who leave. We can rehire 25% of the attrition, and the same thing happens in modernization in the tech side. And then in March, you try to figure out what you can spend in 6 months. The first year I was there, IRS gave back $50 million that they couldn't spend in the year they're there. And I'm like, we're starving and we're giving back money and we're not able to do our job. I mean, you know, you almost felt like saying, why am I here? Right? Nobody's helping us. Flip. Now they've got the funds. So does IRS need $60 billion to build out an AI platform? And are they going to do it inside or outside? What we did, we have 7,000 IT people inside IRS. And because there was not a lot of funding, they couldn't go buy and then modify. So they either fixed or built internally. The vast majority of technology, fixed or built internally. There are about 6,000 IT contractors who work for the IRS, but I include that in sort of the internal because it comes under that part of the budget. So you have about, 12, 13, 14,000 technology people indirectly and directly on board. That's a lot of people in a country like the United States that has a lot of tech. I went up to Silicon Valley, I went to Austin, Texas, to the big tech firms and said, help us, right? You're not all that if you're in some third world country, but you're here, you're founded here, you operate here, et cetera, et cetera. It's important that the IRS and this country is successful for you to be successful, right? I wanted to make sure that as IRS was rebuilding systems, that we didn't wake up in 2030 or 2040 with systems we needed to scrap because the technology folks were going that way. And, they got think tanks. They're out there in 2030 and 2040. They could tell you what they think it's going to be. So we wanted to make sure we were trending in the right direction rather than be where we are now, which was to scrap a lot of the, software and stuff that they have and build new. It should move like the technology world moves. That's very important. COVID, we got billions of dollars of COVID money that we used to enhance our systems. We went into COVID about 72% of the hardware be out of date, which means beyond the warranty and beyond the extended warranty you could get. When I left, we were about 16% out of date. So we took that COVID money and invested it into the hardware. What they're talking about now is the software. Does IRS need $60 billion? I could probably argue both parts of that. The staffing, hiring, training, recruiting is critical. But what I used to say to Treasury and up on the Hill, get me some amount of money for 5 years, $5 billion a year spent on technology for 5 years. That agency in year 5 is going to be a different agency than it is today. I can't tell you, the money they got was 10-year money. None of us can tell what it's going to be like 10 years. We don't know what the technology is going to be like. We do know that we're housed in the U.S., so maintaining, I think, best-in-class technology in-house is a good thing. Now, you may say, and taxpayers may say, gee, there was an article about IRS agents looking over your shoulder when you're using an ATM or the electronic equivalent of that. What technology and AI also provides, yes, it will show sort of the hot spots on the map that we have where they should send out people and look. It'll also show where they shouldn't go, right? And so you create a lot of non-audits. Rather than having audits with no changes, you just don't even open the audits. You move in a different direction. What's critical for taxpayers and tax professional community, this comes back to the tax return, is the ability to explain the anomaly. So in my example, if I gave $10,000 or $20,000 in charitable contributions and I had $100,000 of income, if I did it, it should be in my return, right? There's going to be limitations and all that, but it should go ahead and put it in your return. You can back it up. So keeping the backup, and now electronically, it's hard to say, well, we lost the letter or whatever, right? There should be an electronic file for everybody and the ability to get there. We should limit some of the discussions we used to have historically with the ability to use the electronic information we have going forward. So I hope I hit your question.
Yeah, well, I guess one.
I told you I'm a lawyer, and part of what I do is just to confuse this.
Well, one further to that question is that what about like the security aspects of it, right? I think there's a lot of people out there say, well, if they're using AI and data mining, is this getting like sucked up into ChatGPT, and is like someone going to see my tax return? Like, how does IRS secure taxpayer data, especially with AI mining?
So when I was there, we averaged about 1.4 to 1.6 billion sophisticated cyber attacks per year. The word sophisticated is basically telling you it's North Korea, China, and Russia. And they have institutions that all they do is ping our system. That's our system. So we have sharing agreements with, 80 or 85 countries around the world, because there's U.S. taxpayers there, or there's taxpayers there that invest in the U.S. So we need to have information sharing agreements. And, the weakest link theory, we need to not only make sure that the IRS systems are secure, but every one of those countries needs to have a secure system to our standards as well, or we cut them off. When I was on board, there was a hack of some degree for Belarus, one of the former satellite countries in Eastern Europe. And, I'll say within a second, it wasn't. It was a lot less than that. The link to Belarus went down. Like, we shut it down. So 1.4, let's say 1.5, 1.6, it's 1.4 to 1.6. You're not hearing IRS data getting out 3, 4, 5 times a month. You're hearing it's really not getting out. I can't speak to the ProPublica article, but I will tell you, I don't believe that was a breach. All right. There's ongoing investigations. And so that was, the wealthy people's returns that got published in ProPublica.
And the Musk returns.
Yeah. That stuff didn't come through North Korea. Taxpayer data getting out into the system. The IRS system, like all secure systems, it's an onion. And there's a lot of layers to that onion. And I used to say at the end of the day, You need, the thumbprint from 15 people and the eyes from another 60 people to be able to open up what's in the side in the middle. And it's just not going to happen, right? But he can't get cavalier. And so the resource in that arena is huge. Big Brother, we dealt with ID.me. So we were trying to create portals for people to come in and give us some semblance of a tax return so we could issue VIP payments. ID.me used facial recognition to say, yes, this is or isn't Chuck Rettig. But there was another system where you could get a live person who would ask you questions. We were doing about 1.2 million new taxpayer IDs a week under ID.me. And of that, about 30 or 40,000 were people who opted for an in-person exchange. And then it was like, oh my God, Big Brother, IRS has facial recognition. Well, we don't. They're an outside contractor. There were 20 other federal government agencies that used ID.me. ID.me destroys the data within 30 days, but we had to shut it down with them and kind of reassure people what was there at the same point in time where we were trying to get their data to issue payments. So that's the IRS is concerned about the Big Brother concepts. Most of the people at IRS are very concerned and want people to know that they're real people and they care. And so Big Brother isn't a good thing for that, right? But, we need to have a balance when you consider the responsibilities of the IRS and timeliness in issuing refunds and other payments. We need a balance.
Yeah, I think that's great. One thing I wanted to touch on here is that this might be a little bit in the weeds for the non-practitioners here, but a lot of people have these kind of questions, right? So actually everyone has this kind of question now because as you know, and this kind of probably started when you were there and it's gotten worse since then, what came out of the CARES Act and the Families First Act and all that stuff are all these different COVID programs, one of them being ERC. So everyone knows we deal with the incoming questions all day long about, hey, I got the call on my cell phone that I qualify for ERC because everyone does. I know you weren't there for all of it, but what is the IRS doing right now to combat the promoters of this? Because, we call them the pop-up shops. They're coming out of the woodworks and they're selling you anything you want for a fee. And ultimately, unfortunately, we tell people the taxpayer is going to end up holding the bag on that. They extended the statute of limitations and whatnot. They're going to pay significant penalties for these scams. But what about the promoters, right? Because I feel like sometimes they might just sail into the sunset. Like, how does IRS view the people that are selling these things that are probably not qualified for?
The promoters are going to say that they only got the information from the taxpayer and they submitted it, or had the taxpayer's professionals submit it. The promoter is not going to take the hit. There are and will be criminal cases. People will go to prison for that. Some will be promoters. Some may well be taxpayers. At the end of the day, it's a taxpayer's tax return. And, like it or not, taxpayers are responsible for what's in the return. With ERC and then, shelters and all the rest, you have sort of a too good to be true theory. Some of this is not rocket science, right? So this person tells me I can get this huge credit, because of COVID, and they got it for all these other people, and nobody ever had a problem. The problem with that is IRS operates on a delayed basis. So if something gets filed now, Congress is all over IRS, issue the payments now, and then a year or thereabouts from now, IRS comes back. What we see is they're going to come back heavy, right? They have data, and they know who the people are and all that. They're getting the resources, both human and otherwise, to be able to filter the systems and go after it. I think they announced recently they're either going to reduce or stop issuing the payments. You have till April, I think, of 25 to submit. The administration asked, it's percolating that they want to cut that to April of 24. Don't give people so much time because we're under the gun. 2 lines of thoughts. Yes, we don't need, another 100,000 or whatever, 100 million, 10 million fraudulent ERC claims. The other side of that is a lot of these are small businesses who are just sort of getting their act together, and they're eligible for this and they're entitled to it. So there's the balancing of that. Every administration wants everybody who's eligible to get what they get. No person wants the bad guys to get it. So you are going to see criminal cases around the country, and you're going to see them highly publicized. That's the best deterrence they have, because the business person and anything tax and IRS, they don't think of prison time. But the cases that IRS investigates and DOJ prosecutes end up in prison. about 98% conviction rate, which includes guilty pleas. And the only cases they go after are ones where somebody's going to prison. And under the sentencing guidelines, at around $30,000 of what's called tax loss, right? The amount due to the government, somebody gets a year and a day, and that's a felony. And a year and a day, you have to do 85% of that. So you've got to do, 10 plus months in a prison. Oh, you're only going to go to an Air Force base for 8+ months with some of your best friends. The business person doesn't want any piece of that, right? Better to, I think, and this comes from 36 years in the trench dealing with civil tax disputes, but also criminal tax investigations and prosecutions. Better to go in and work out some payment term if I owe IRS money or than it is to go after what looks to be low-hanging fruit to only find that it's poisonous fruit, right? That's not good for anybody. And as far as I know, a lot of people get pitched from promoters and then they take it to their tax professional, and the tax professional is like, I'm not doing any independent work on this. I'm just putting it into the return. And tax professionals are in a tough spot because do you want to say to your client of 3, 4, 5, or 10 years, I'm not doing this for you. And then maybe the client goes somewhere else. That's the business of there. And the professional part of what's there is to say, listen, so IRS needs to help tax professionals and have more visibility in this area. And the way they do visibility is the criminal cases.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that, what you just said echoes true for a lot of CPAs and clients. You can name the place off the tip of your tongue that are promoting this, but there are, like you said, we deal a lot of people that generally qualified for ERC, but now you're so late in the game, right? And they're getting the calls, well, my friends all got it and they didn't get in trouble. But like you said, because that trouble hasn't started yet, right? That's coming. And I think the other thing, there's ERC is just the latest. I think more in the weeds. There's been, for years, IRS has kind of pursued easements and captives and all these other things, right, that are technically in the law, but have been exposed, right, or manipulated beyond the bounds of the law, right? And oftentimes, I think the promoters, or I think now some of them are being criminally prosecuted, but for years, the promoters got rich and the clients are stuck holding the bag right when the audit comes. So it does put everyone in a tough position because the client thinks they did nothing wrong because a professional, which is a promoter, signed off on something and the CPA is like, I don't really know. I'm just filing what's on the form. So I just think overall, it's a tough position for people, but it's good to hear that guidance from you.
I remember, in the captive, not in the captive, but in the conservation easement space, the real problem there is it got out too big, too far for IRS to catch up to, right? When I was there were about 80,000 cases, $30 billion of deductions, right? And so IRS needs to, and so we created an emerging issues group, service-wide, to sort of identify and spot and then go after earlier rather than letting them get out there and then chasing the horses that are over the horizon. Ask yourselves, it's not uncommon to see a conservation easement. It's the law. It's a good thing. It supports good thing. It's when it gets promoted and exploited that the issues pop up. But many of the cases, you have somebody bought property for $2 million, and they contributed to an entity at a $4 million valuation, and then they drop a conservation easement on it, and somebody says that has reduced the value $40 million, right? These cases are there. And all of that happened within a year, right? Because they want to get the deduction this year. I don't think you need tax degrees and accounting degrees to go, okay, this seems a little awkward, right? Oh, my buddies are getting it. Yeah, but, do you want that? And, an audit is an audit of the whole return. Do you want them in your life? Do you want them in your business? Do you want them in your this, and this, So
yeah, totally. It's one of those things. I think there's so many of these things out there, but people hear about them. And that, just like you said, oh, my buddy's got them, right? Do I qualify? Why do I not qualify? But interesting. So a couple other things we want to touch on here. So what, the IRS, I think oftentimes people don't realize, right? You guys are not, or you were not the lawmaking body. It's purely guidance based and the authority of the tax code. But oftentimes I think, as a practitioner, we see a good example. I don't know if you kept up with it, but we've had a lot of research and development stuff. And just like last week, they dropped this guidance on this research and development change. like 4 days ahead of the deadline. So how is the sausage actually made internally where taxpayers are waiting for this guidance from their CPAs who are waiting for the guidance from the IRS on how to implement the law, but yet it takes so long. R&D was changed in 2017, I think, but now here we are 6 years later without guidance. So what like holds that whole process up from coming to fruition?
Well, remember, I was part of IRS, so I'm going to blame Treasury. So IRS is a Bureau of Treasury. IRS is not allowed to issue guidance independent from Treasury. The folks at Treasury, and Treasury is, so it's IRS Treasury, right? Every Treasury secretary and every Treasury has a different focal point of where they want to go, right? Right now, you're hearing green energy and such, right? So if you're not on a priority plan for Treasury, IRS could not get you on a priority plan, even if they wanted to do so independently. The people at the IRS get it because IRS is the front lines, right? So we're, and they're out there talking to people, conferences, et cetera, and everybody's saying the same thing. Hey, when are you guys going to, give us some guidance, right? Bad guidance is better than no guidance, right? At least you know where they are, and then you know how to put something in a return, and you can put a disclosure statement in the return and says, your guidance is full of it. Here's really what's going on, right? So I used to say, I'd rather have bad guidance than no guidance. We don't want to operate in the dark, but IRS, you're not helping us, right? We were very sensitive to that, not to the point where we could make a lot of things happen. We could lobby to put things higher on the Treasury priority plans, right? And we're in the room with Treasury explaining things, but our explanations are more on administrability of certain rules and regulations that they may say we should have, rather than should we or shouldn't we have some rules and regulations. I give you an example in a little bit different area, but there were 2 or 3 listed transactions when I came on board. In around 2000, there were 23 listed transactions. So the abusive type transactions didn't go away. It's just that various treasuries decided not to list them, but it takes Treasury to list them. So then we came out and said, so we want to do a watch list. You won't let us do listing. We want to do a watch list.
Is that the dirty dozen?
Well, you're right where it is, because telling people we're looking at these are on our radar screen. So if you look at the dirty dozen about a year ago, it used to be phone scams and things. About a year ago, it included Malta plans and that. That was us, because they wouldn't let us call it a watch list, right? That had sort of a negative connotation, but they allowed us to put it in the dirty dozen. So you actually had, for the first time, substantive type transactions in the dirty dozen. I believe that the IRS owes it to everybody, taxpayers and tax professionals, to let people know what we think is abusive or wrong. A solo tax professional has difficulty making the arguments to a taxpayer that some transaction doesn't work when it's being promoted and it's got, $50 million behind it of, big law firms, big accounting firms, economists, and all this saying it works, and IRS is silent. IRS needs to be out there visible and say, listen, this is what we're seeing, and these are the hot spots inside there, what we're seeing. So guidance, to me, is critical. I got to put a plug in. My pitch was always single syllable guidance. A 700-page Treasury regulation isn't going to help any, right?
I mean,
how about
the
paragraph?
the thing that came out on the R&D the other day, I had another CPA that was kind enough to send me his interpretation of it, but it's like 36 pages, and it's like Friday night, and I'm like, I have better things to do, I think. So, no, it's interesting to see how that's made. One other thing that we got a question from the audience was, we didn't hit on this, but cryptocurrency, right? So complex, there's these potential laws being passed for reporting, but how is IRS trying to keep up with that? I mean, using when professionals get it right from these ledgers, it's like, how do you make sense of it? How is IRS trying to keep up with cryptocurrencies, especially the stuff that's not like on an exchange?
Yep. So there are no anonymous transactions in virtual currencies. Just doesn't exist. People talk about Monero, people talk about this, talk about that. The 2019 return had a yes/no question. It was on a Schedule I, right? Schedule 1. It then got moved forward, where ultimately it was on the first page of the return. I know they're electronic, but first page of the return right under the address. That was purposeful. That was to convey a message. That came right out of the commissioner's office. I'm the guy who actually drafted the first version on 2019 return, which I will say now, we were not timely. We were timely to get it in the return. We were not timely to be able to do the software to be able to scrape it from the return, but the deterrent impact of, hey, they're asking a virtual currency question, and everybody took a shot at, they don't have the right to ask this, this, and this. All that did was keep it in the air, and IRS kind of refined the question appropriately so, but they also moved it forward. Guidance in this area is key. IRS is like 5 years behind on guidance on an area that's moving at light speed, and in between is tax professionals caught with it. But at the end of the day, that question is a yes-no question by design. It's like the FBAR question. You know, do you have any interest in a foreign account? It's a yes-no question by design. Better to answer yes and explain it later than to answer no. No is going, and IRS is getting data, right? You're familiar with the John Doe summons cases on, Kraken, on Coinbase, et cetera, et cetera. Those will continue. Why is IRS in the space? The first round, John Doe summons, Coinbase, IRS got 11,000 data for 11,000 taxpayers from Coinbase on a John Doe summons approved by a district court. IRS ran that data through the IRS system. Out of the 11,000, less than 50 had some indicia of virtual currency on their return. These are taxpayers where the John Doe summons asked for, is there an area code of this, some indicia of US in their system. They then went out with Kraken and others, and it percolated up a little bit. The real details, look at the revenue agents' affidavits that are supporting the John Doe summonses every time they go after a crypto exchange, and you'll see they're updating the information, right? Crypto is, it depends on the day. I was trying to figure out how to say this, politely, but somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 trillion market, right? 2 years ago, it was about $13 trillion in transactions. The U.S. GDP is about a third of the world. So arguably the U.S. should be about a third, give or take. Let's say there should be 20% of $12 trillion in transactions somehow reflected gains and losses in the system. Back up to the data I already gave you, you got 50. You know something's wrong. Congress knows something's wrong, right? So they got to get out ahead of it. For the tax professionals, they've got to get the guidance, and they've got to get it right. The first guidance that IRS issued, terms were wrong. I mean, everybody there should have been embarrassed. They were working hard. They thought they had it right, but they didn't have specialists inside. There's less than a handful of virtual currency specialists inside the IRS, right? And so they're working hard. I will say, as a cautionary note, while I was on board, from the criminal side, IRS knows who's operating in virtual currencies all over the place. And real quickly, while I was on board, we took down the largest child exploitation site in history, 338 arrests, 37 countries, 23 actively exploited children rescued. It was operating in the dark net virtual currency. We took down terrorist financing sites for Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, operating in the dark net using virtual currency. You saw the young couple up in New York who recently pled guilty. IRS seized a wallet from the cloud it was a Binance hack, had about, I think the public statement was $3.5 billion in the wallet. IRS owns the dark net, and this is IRS criminal investigation. There's over 300 special agents who live in the virtual currency space. There are no anonymous transactions. So if they can take down, and these are IRS cases because that's IRS jurisdiction, dark net virtual currency. If they can take down child exploitation sites, if they can take down Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, they can find Joe's garage that's parking a little money out there and not telling anyone, right?
Just about resources, right?
Yeah, they're getting, and now they got $60 billion. You'll see the impact of that as we go forward. And, at the end of the day, it's going to be a much better, more efficient agency.
I think it's, that's so key. I mean, when we told Chuck before this that we saw the IRS criminal head, Jim Lee, speak about a month or two ago, and he mentioned that it was fascinating that people don't realize the IRS, civil side, but there's also the criminal side, which is the law enforcement agency, and they taking down more cryptocurrency, I believe, than any other agency in the United States government. And they hold so much cryptocurrency. It's mind blowing. So I think that's key. And I think for us and for clients, it's really about guidance, right? And I think when they're not on exchange, they just have this data and they're like, what do I do with this? And I think it's all about trying your best, right? To comply. And like you said, answer as best you can. And if you're wrong, you can explain and work with the IRS to fix it.
In the examination context, if you have enough where you can show you made a substantial effort to do your homework before whatever went in the return, personally, I think you should be fine. Both the taxpayer and the tax professional.
Fascinating.
I think we're starting to run up against time here, Chuck. It's been very informative and insightful. Now, just wanted to ask, like post commissioner life, like what are you focusing your time on now? What kind of projects do you have going on?
So it's interesting. I was a tax lawyer in a tax law firm environment for 36 years. But I got a taste of helping people through the IRS, the languages, underserved communities, CARES Act, and that kind of thing. So trying to improve things. I am on several boards. I'm senior advisor to several firms. I've put my hand up to about 90% of the groups that said, hey, can you do something here or there? But, just as an example, I'm on the board of an entity called K1X, right? What they do is digitize K1s. And so rather than manual input, their platform digitizes. And, the first time and remember, I have a wife who's in the tax department, very familiar with K1s and the manual input and all that. IRS data, a paper return IRS takes and puts the data in is about a 25% error rate. When IRS scans that return in, this is IRS tax returns. When IRS scans that return in, it's about a 15% error rate. When it comes in digitally, it's between 4 and 6%. So, and this is not the plug for K1X, but I'm going to show you why I'm interested. So they put 200 K1s into their platform, and I see this whole string of green check marks come up, right? And then there were like 3 red check marks. The platform told whoever's operating it, you need to look at these 3. The rest are seamless, right? So you take manual input, who nobody wants to do that, into that system, and you put it in, and coming back to your taxpayers want their refunds quicker, having that match. So it goes from the generator, right, all the way through to IRS digitally. And I think is going to help significantly change the tax professional group. And if you saw I think what's called Alliant Talent, did a report. It was on Accounting Today recently. So they did a survey. Only 1% of the accounting firms, 250 accounting firms surveyed, had sufficient human resources to meet their needs, right? Well, that's similar to what we saw at IRS. It's similar to what we're all experiencing. There's not waves of people going, oh, I want to be a tax professional or an accountant or a CPA or whatnot. So the world is going where IRS is also going, which is digitizing AI and all that. And there's a lot of things like this K1X that kind of there. And so one of my things has been, and I've talked to several other firms that do, helping them with respect to, encrypting stuff to move it around. Can we get better for little or no cost, right? And then take the human resources and upskill them, right? So the person who comes into your firm, instead of spending a season banging in, K1s and K3s and whatnot, put them the last person on a team somewhere else where they're actually going to learn something that next year they're going to be training somebody else in what they learned this year. And now you got a career employee and they're in a better position. So that's sort of exciting to me to see people. And, somebody has community organization type things where they think I could be an assistant. I'm all in. Any underserved community, and pick your definition of underserved. And, like I said, I've got in-laws who live in Little Saigon who don't speak English. And I understand the hurdles that are there. And it's hurdles that the rest of us create by not really being sensitive enough. And that's just kind of one example. So I'm not handing out the commissioner title so somebody pays me something. I'm 67. I had a good career. My wife still loves me, even though I was at IRS for all these years. And so where we can help going forward, we're interested in helping. So it's
That's awesome. Very profound. And yeah, that mission it's a great one. It definitely touches, what we do too. And I think that's awesome. I think the last question is, can you give us any insight on what it was like to work with the presidents of the United States, either administration, any insight in your experiences there?
Well, the IRS is a Bureau of Treasury, so we don't interact with a president. We don't interact with anybody out of the White House. Point in fact, when the current administration came in, somebody at Treasury reached out, sent me an email and said, hey, these people at the White House want to know who at IRS they can interact with, right? And my response was no one. That we don't, we call the White House their neighbor. If you know you got White House, you got Treasury, and then a couple blocks away, you've got IRS, right? So Treasury and White House are neighbors. So I said, we don't deal with your neighbor, and your neighbor should not place any calls to anybody inside the Internal Revenue Service, that we are impartial or career, and we work for the country, right? We don't work for, I never saw myself working for an administration. And I used to explain it to the guys at Treasury, both Treasuries. You've got White House, Treasury, and IRS. And they go, no, you're a bureau. I go, we only go over there if only one person at a time could fire me, and it was either president, and send me home to LA, where I have my friends, my house, my this, my that. And as long as I'm here, we're over here, and you guys are over there. You do tax policy. Tax policy is a political thing. Do we move into child credits and this and that, or don't we? That's their world. If they decide to do it, IRS implements and does the administration. So really interacted with two different Treasury secretaries, Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary Yellen. Secretary Mnuchin, every Thursday, 3:30, 2-hour meeting to talk about anything I wanted to talk about. He was very engaged with the IRS. I'll say this if he gets out. I think he's in Europe somewhere, but permanently. But I'll say that he was not a touchy-feely guy, but boy, if you needed somebody to back you up, and he'd go up to the hill and sort of wreak havoc. That was my vision of it, And so, yeah, there were calls where, and he wanted no surprises, rightfully so, right? He didn't want to go up the hill and hear IRS had a train wreck. So tell him anything. He says, you got 80,000 people, you deal with every American. You guys are going to have some issues, but make sure I know. And other than that, it's your shop. Run your shop. And, there was one day I got a cold call from a senator that should not have come to me. And so reached out to him, and it had to do with a funding issue. It had to do with a $40 billion funding issue, right? And he said, well, what do you want me to do? And I said, well, this was obviously front and center. I'd appreciate if you'd call this guy, right? This is what he told me. I appreciate you calling. You want me to call him tonight, or you want me to call him tomorrow? And I go, well, I think they're meeting on it. He goes, then hang up. I'll call him now. To me, that was like my bodyguard, because we're trying to get Congress to give us something so we can make ourselves better. So that was huge. Current Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, the Deputy Secretary, is in that role, right? Secretary Yellen is sort of taking a different role that Secretary Mnuchin took when he was there. And I believe every secretary, those are the only secretaries that I know. So I believe they're all different. So, from my perspective, some people will say we served the administration, but we did not. And I'll close and tell you, I was at a Senate hearing. If you really want some comedy and you're up late at night, go look at C-SPAN, some of my hearings. I went to my hearings. I went to every hearing thinking I'm going to get fired when I get back to the office, but I didn't go to roll over for what some senator thought was important or false facts. But there was one Senate Finance hearing. Senate Finance, very important. They control the funds that IRS gets and the funds the country spends. Senate Finance hearing, a senator working up a question said, I want you to know I support funding IRS technology. And he paused, and then he said, and I'm a Republican. Well, I'm in the middle of the room, and I should be smart enough to not, there's no question there. So I'd be smart enough to just let that go. But my wife says, I was the only agency head that she thought routinely stuck my head out to get cut off. So I leaned into it, and I said, so I think y'all should know, there's 28 senators of the Senate Finance Committee. I said, I think y'all should know, I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. California has a decline to state. It's not even independent. It's just decline to state, right? Which makes us free range. And I said, but I am a proud American. And I said, every proud American should support funding IRS technology so it's ready for the next crisis, whether it's COVID or otherwise, to do what you want us to do. And then I look up and I said, you all should be telling me you're a proud American, not that you're a member of a political party. And Senator Wyden was ranking member, Senator Wyden was chair, Senator Crapo was ranking member. And they got used to me after a while. And I could see as I'm saying this, that you see them look at each other and go, did he do that again? Like, and of course, with that, there's a chorus of, we're proud Americans and we'll figure out how to get you that funding. Both sides, right? What do they, at the end of the day, IRS is very important. Give whatever oversight you want. Call the head of the IRS in for all meetings and scream at them. But make sure the agency runs efficiently and is able to do its job in the enforcement compliance world, in the service world, et cetera, and help it, and have people respect it. It's not a perfect agency, and all the rest. So anyway, I apologize for running over, but I want people to know
fascinating stuff. Well, yeah, thanks again, Chuck, for taking the time today, even more than generous of the time. I mean, really, really, really great. I know I connected with you on LinkedIn, so I encourage people to connect with him on LinkedIn. I'm sure you'll be posting more stuff there. In the meantime, really appreciate it. Added a lot of value to us today, and best of luck with everything, and hopefully we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, guys. John, great.
Thank you, Chuck.
Well,
take care. Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.